Good morning, everyone. I am Prachi Politega, your host and moderator for the session. Welcome back to the third session of the second day of the International Conference. Before we begin, I would like to request all of you to kindly mute yourselves in order to have an ordered and uninterrupted session. This will aid us for a seamless progression of the event. The Zoom meeting room is closed now, but we are currently live on YouTube. So those of you who were unable to connect with us on Zoom, kindly interact with us through the YouTube link provided earlier. The chat box on Zoom is currently inactive, but it is open on YouTube. It will be activated on Zoom during the question answer segment of the session. The queries can be posted there so that it can be taken up with the resource person. Thank you for your patient hearing. This was just a small announcement from my side in the beginning. Honorable Principal and Patron, Dr. Sister Jyoti. Honorable Vice Principal, Sister Shobha. Honorable Resource Person for the session, Dr. Shreya Bhattacharji, Associate Professor, Department of English Studies, Central University of Jharkhand. Conveners of the online interdisciplinary international conference, Dr. Rashmi Mala Sahu and Dr. Afrinul Haq Khan. CPE Coordinator, Dr. Debjani Roy. Members of the organizing team, faculty members of various colleges and universities, research scholars, students, and my dear colleagues. On behalf of the organizing team, I extend a warm welcome to the third session of the three-day UGC CP sponsored online interdisciplinary international conference on COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on human society, divergent voices and perspectives. Today we have with us Dr. Shreya Bhattacharji, who will be presenting her presentation, which is going to focus on seminal works in literature, art, and science created during times of pandemic from the 8th century BC to our contemporary COVID-19 times. This is going to lend us much needed hope to tide over such difficult times. With the august presence of our principal and patron, Dr. Sister Jyoti, and the esteemed resource person, may I now request Dr. Jaya Rajlakshmi, Department of Political Science, to kindly introduce our resource person for the session. Over to you, Jaya ma'am.
Thank you, Prachi. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our resource person today, who is going to talk to us about voices of hope and wings of creativity, surviving COVID-19 pandemic. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Shreya Bhattacharji, who is an associate professor in the Department of English Studies, Central University of Jharkhand, Ranchi, India. Her academic interests include post-colonial studies, especially African, Afro-American, Caribbean, queer, and women's writing, border and partition studies, and contemporary literary theories. She has published widely and has been invited to numerous conferences in India as well as in the United States, France, Hungary, South Africa, and South Korea. Formerly a civil services officer, she also nurtures a keen interest in human rights, tribal and gender issues. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Shreya Bhattacharji. I welcome you, Dr. Shreya, to start your presentation. Over to you, Dr. Shreya.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you are.
Yes, ma'am.
Good morning, everyone. First and foremost, I would like to thank Sister Jyoti and Nirmala College Ranchi for giving me this platform. I would also like to thank Dr. Afrin Haq and my student, Barkha, from the Department of English, Nirmala College, for inviting me. Without further ado, I would like to begin my presentation straight on. I would like to share the screen. If it's okay, I'll do a PowerPoint presentation.
Yes, ma'am. 1 minute. Yes, it is on.
Okay. Is it visible?
Yes, ma'am, it is visible.
Right. So my presentation today is titled Voices of Hope and Wings of Creativity, Surviving COVID-19 Pandemic. The last almost 4 months now has been very difficult for each one of us. But this is not the first time that life has been difficult for human beings. Today, I will invite all the participants to travel with me on a journey that would begin in the 8th century BC and bring us back to our present times. I would like to begin with a text with which many of us are familiar, Homer's Iliad. You see, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, these two are the foremost texts of ancient Greek literature, and they date back to the 8th century BC. Many of you would perhaps be surprised to know that the action in this epic poem, the Iliad, begins when Chryses, the Trojan priest of Apollo, offers the Greeks a handsome ransom for the return of his daughter Chryses, who had been held captive by Agamemnon, the Greek leader, in an earlier war. Now, the Greek army, it is in favor of accepting this offer, but Agamemnon, being the arrogant leader that he is, refuses. And herein begins our interest. That is, the priest of Apollo of Troy, Chryses, prays to Apollo. And what does Apollo do? Apollo causes a plague, afflict the Greek army. After 9 days of plague, Achilles, another Greek leader, calls an assembly. Agamemnon agrees to return Chryses' father, but takes Achilles' captive, Briseis, in compensation. An enraged Achilles declares that he will no longer fight for Agamemnon and he will go home. Odysseus, the other hero, he takes a ship, returns Chryses to her father, and Apollo ends the plague. This is just the beginning of the story. A lot more will happen in the text. What we are particularly interested in is that in a text written as early as the 8th century BC, there is a reference to the plague and the way the gods visit the plague upon humans when they are unhappy. The next text, which is also extremely interesting, and almost all of us are familiar with it, even those who do not do literature, that is Sophocles' Oedipus Rex. It is a tragedy which was first performed around 429 BC. It is one of the foremost texts even today, and perhaps all of you know that Sigmund Freud coined his most important psychiatric complex, the Oedipus complex, based on this text. Now, this play begins in a plague that ravaged the city-state of Thebes. The reference is to the 430-429 BC plague that had attacked the city of Athens. Now, when the play begins, Oedipus is already the king of Thebes, he has unwittingly fulfilled the prophecy that he would kill his father Laius and marry his mother Jocasta. He has already done this. And the play is concerned with how Oedipus can search for the murderer of Laius to prevent the plague from completely ruining the city of Thebes. Now, because it is an astonishingly good, play, so he is unaware, Oedipus is unaware that he himself is the killer he is looking for. When the truth comes to light at the very end, Jocasta hangs herself and Oedipus gouges out his eyes because he is horrified at the patricide. He has killed his father, and incest. He has married his mother. Now, Oedipus Rex is a text which reflects very deeply upon the responsibilities and duties that a head of state needs to take at the time of acute crises. For example, an epidemic. And it becomes extremely relevant in our contemporary times. How would the different heads of states handle a crisis of this stature? What Oedipus Rex was doing in 429 BC, the heads of state are expected to do today in 2020. If we look at the Bible, we find several references as to the plague or other epidemics being God's punishment for human sin. In fact, the spread of plague is seen as a warning to the Israelites to behave morally. This relationship, this cause and effect relationship between sin and plague as retribution is seen not only in the Iliad, as we saw, or in Oedipus Rex, but also in the Bible. On your right, you can see an illustration, a biblical illustration of the plague by Paul Gustave Doré, the French artist. Now, that was in the ancient times. If we move a little further down to the medieval times, we are confronted with the Black Death. The Black Death, which is perhaps the deadliest pandemic recorded in history, which resulted in the death of 25 to 200 million people in Eurasia and North Africa. This was a bubonic plague, and it was caused by the Yersinia pestis, a bacteria. And it peaked in Europe in between 1347 and 1351. The Black Death reached Italy in 1348, unleashing death. Now, one of the foremost Italian writers, Giovanni Boccaccio, experienced the plague personally as it ravaged the city of Florence in 1948. And this pandemic experience inspired him to write the Decameron. It was written between 1348 and 1353. The introduction has a graphic description of the epidemic as it ravages the city of Florence. Now, it has a very interesting frame. It is structured as a frame story told by a group of 7 women, young women, and 3 young men who are in quarantine in a villa outside the city of Florence. Each day, they decide to tell a story to the others. That means 10 stories every day. And each day has a theme. And the last speaker is the author himself, who will not follow the theme. Now, they have quarantined themselves for 15 days, but they would not tell the stories on Sabbath, and they would also not tell the stories on the days that they are busy. So in 10 days, they tell a sum total of 100 stories, and that creates the Decameron. And the stories range from love to practical joke to life lessons, you name it. And the Decameron went on to become a major influence on the English poet Geoffrey Chaucer, and especially on his work, The Canterbury Tales. In The Canterbury Tales, if you have read one of the tales, The Pardoner's Tale, it also has a very strong reference to the plague. Now, if we move further down, from 1592 to 93, London experienced a major plague outbreak. 15,000 people died within the city, another almost 5,000 people died in the surrounding areas. Now, one of the most remarkable tragedies of Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, is supposed to have been written between 1591 and 1595, and it was performed in sometime between 1595 and 97. In this particular play, there is a direct reference to the plague. You see, the letter, almost at the end of the play, I'm talking about the end of the play, Juliet sends a letter to Romeo saying that she will pretend to be dead and he has to come and he has to rescue her. But that letter never reaches Romeo because the messenger is forced into quarantine before he can complete his mission. And therefore, Romeo doesn't know it, and that results in the subsequent tragedy in which both Juliet and Romeo are killed. Now, on March 24th, 1603, you see the iconic Queen of England, Elizabeth I, dies without an heir. James VI of Scotland becomes the King of England as James I, but his reign begins with a devastating plague, and James I's first action was to issue a book of orders which outlined the rules and procedures to be followed to stop the spread of the plague and to aid those suffering from it. You can look at your right to see a copy of the order, which was published in 1603. Now, while I was thinking about this presentation for the last, believe me, for the last almost 20 days, I have been thinking about this. I was thinking that look at Shakespeare, in his entire lifespan, he seems to have suffered the outbreak of the plague epidemic so many times. The theaters would open, a new play would begin to be performed, and then suddenly everything would close down because a plague has been declared. 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, all the playhouses are closed. Again, it begins, again, there might be a plague, right? And within that, he writes some of the most brilliant plays ever. You see, in 1603, his company, Shakespeare's company, Lord Chamberlain's Men, becomes the king's men, and they get some kind of funding from the king. But as I told you, the performances were infrequent, theaters were closed because people feared that the plague would spread through the crowds. And it reminds us of our days, doesn't it, of COVID-19, the fear of crowds. And it was during this time, 1603, 1604, which was a major plague year with the theaters being closed, that Shakespeare wrote Measure for Measure, and it was performed in 1604. Now, the play is set in an unruly Vienna, and which is heavily afflicted with disease. And obviously, Shakespeare draws inspiration from the plague-ridden London that he sees all around him. What is very interesting is that the disease that Shakespeare sees all around him does not find a direct reflection in the play, as we saw in Romeo and Juliet. Rather, it seems to have been metamorphosed into a kind of sexual excessiveness and sexual laxity that we see in almost all the characters of Measure for Measure. If we move on to his other major tragedy, Othello, this was also written during the plague year of 1603-1604, and it was also performed in 1604. Now, in this also, there is no direct reference to plague per se. It doesn't form a part of the storyline per se, but the unwarranted and incomprehensible ravage caused by the plague seems to be reflected in the play, in the malignancy, the motiveless malignancies that Iago shows towards Desdemona and towards Othello. You know, the plague. Why should something like the plague occur? Why should it claim so many lives? There is no answer to that. Similarly, there is no answer to the malignancy of Iago, the way he acts towards both Desdemona and Othello. Now, three of Shakespeare's very well-known plays, King Lear, Macbeth, and Antony and Cleopatra, they were all originally drafted during 1605-1606, when the play continued to ravage London and its surroundings. King Lear was first performed in 1606, Macbeth in 1606, and Antony and Cleopatra in 1607. And the dark atmosphere, the atmosphere of despair and disillusionment reflects the London of those times. I will suggest, for those of you who are interested, please listen to Professor Emma Smith's lecture in the Oxford at Home series called Shakespeare and the Plague. If we move a little further, perhaps we would not really have seen John Milton as a poet, the poet of Paradise Lost, if in the very first year of his undergraduate year in 1626, he had not been sent to his home to be in isolation when the town was hit by the bubonic plague of 1625-1626. This was the time when Milton first began to write. His first Latin elegy, Elegia Prima, was written while he was in isolation. The next devastating plague, and this was the last of the bubonic plagues, was in that hit the city of London, was the Great Plague of London in 1665. As I told you, this series of intermittent bubonic plague epidemics originated in Central Asia in 1331, the year of the Black Death, and it continued till 1750, and it had other forms also, such as the pneumonic plague. Now, one of the most interesting and detailed narratives of the plague of 1665 is a journal of the plague year by Daniel Defoe, which was first published in 1722. Now, of course, Daniel Defoe was there. He experienced the plague of 1665, but he was only 5 years old at that time. So it is actually borrowed from his uncle, and the events, the anecdotes, the statistics. He had done a lot of research to write this journal, which is one man's experience of the year 1665. Perhaps you will be surprised to know that Michel Foucault, the French theorist, he refers to a journal of the plague year in his seminal work, Discipline and Punish. And he talks about how the city was compartmentalized, the laws became very stringent, emergency was declared, the regime became authoritative. And he goes on to say that once a regime becomes authoritative and takes certain measures, it usually does not withdraw them later. To come to science, it is, perhaps you will be surprised that the same year, 1665-66, which had influenced Daniel Defoe so powerfully, also had a great influence on the renowned physicist and mathematician Isaac Newton, who perhaps is one of the most influential scientists of all times. As a student of Trinity College, Cambridge, he was sent home during the plague of 1665-66. He thrived in isolation and later described it as one of the most productive times in his life. In fact, he says that he found the space to reflect on and developed his theories of optics, calculus, laws of motion, and gravity. Of course, Newton went on to write his scientific achievements as the much later date. So the exact dates of his works are unknown, but that he did a lot of reflection and subsequent experimentation during this period of self-isolation is a fact. If we come to the Romantic age and we talk about Lord Byron, one of the major Romantic poets, and every time I look at this, I am a little amused because Lord Byron was forced to quarantine in Malta in 1811 after returning from cholera ravaged Greece. And he was furious because he had to spend 40 days in lockdown, a measure which he considered to be draconian and unnecessary. While confined, he wrote this poem called Farewell to Malta, which is a satirical poem, and where he attacks the island for its smoky towns, cloudy sky, cursed street of stairs. And in fact, his first verse goes, Adieu, thou damnedest quarantine that gave me fever and the spleen. I could not resist taking a little from the conclusion of the poem, where a very angry Lord Byron is talking about his quarantine, his lockdown time in Malta, and he says that what shall he do? And he says, I'll not offend with words uncivil and wish thee rudely at the devil, but only stare from out my casement and ask for what is such a place meant. Then in my solitary nook, return to scribbling or a book, or take my physique while I am able, 2 spoonfuls hourly by the label, prefer my nightcap to my beaver, and bless the gods, I have got a fever. You can see the mock satire, the mock sardonic tone of the poet, and obviously it relates to so well to what each one of us are doing at the moment. The next text, which also greatly interested me, we all of us know Mary Shelley, the wife of Percy Shelley, and for her novel Frankenstein. But here is The Last Man, which was published in 1826, and it is perhaps one of the first apocalyptic novels. It's very interesting. In the introduction, she says that she discovered a collection of prophetic writings painted in leaves, by the Cumean Sibyl, and she has edited those writings into the current narrative. If you read the text of The Last Man, it reads as a first person narrative of a man living at the end of the 21st century. That is, the narrative begins in 2073 and concludes in 21,000. Now, it is a futuristic story of love and the gradual extermination of the human race by plague. And it has very interesting portraits of Mary Shelley's compatriots, whether it be her husband, Percy Shelley, or Lord Byron, and a host of other people, right? And it expresses a strong reaction against romanticism and demonstrates the failure of imagination and art to redeem the human race. It is a very, as I told you, it is an apocalyptic novel. It is sad because by then Mary Shelley was the only one alive. All her compatriots were already dead. You will be interested to know that after 1826, it was never reprinted till 1965, when it received a lot of attention, because by then this lastness, and this prophecy of doom seemed to have come partially true and had become more relevant. If we move a little to the United States, we have the American poet and novelist Edgar Allan Poe, who published a short story, The Mask of the Red Dead, in 1842. It is unique in the literary tradition of the plague because it focuses on the metaphorical. Here, plague is personified as a mysterious figure disguised as a Red Death victim. The author meditates on the inevitability of death, but, and this is what I would ask all of you to pay attention to, the issue is not that people die from the plague. The issue is that people are plagued by the death, by the thought of death, by the fear of death, by the anxiety of death. And that is what we need to overcome. The next very interesting novel is the Scarlet Plague by Jack London, once again an American novelist. We are familiar with him. This is also a post-apocalyptic novel which was first published in the London magazine in 1912. Now, what is interesting about this novel is that it foresaw the unusually deadly influenza pandemic in history, the Spanish influenza of 1918-1920, which was caused by the H1N1 influenza virus. Now, this was published in 1912, and 6 years later, the Spanish flu had become a reality and caused the death of 20 million people worldwide. Now, it is especially relevant to our times because it was written at a time when travel was neither so easy nor possible for so many people. But 100 years down the lane, look at us now with COVID-19. This text, Pale Horse, Pale Rider, is by Catherine Annie Porter, an American journalist. And it was published in 1939, and it talks about the relationship between a newspaper woman, Miranda, and a soldier, Adam, against the influenza epidemic of 1918. You see, the narrative is set in Denver. Miranda becomes sick. She recovers to find that Adam dies of the disease, which he caught most probably while tending to her. Now, if you look at the title, Pale Horse, Pale Rider, obviously you understand that it is biblical. It is taken from the Revelation, and the four horsemen of the apocalypse or doom are obviously the conqueror on a white horse, war on a red horse, famine on a black horse, and death on a pale horse. You will be interested to know that this short novel is also partially autobiographical, in the sense that Porter herself was a survivor of the 1918-1920 influenza epidemic, and she says that this short novel is about the Pale Rider Death, who has taken away an entire era. Now, if we move to the field of art, there are two artists that I would like to talk about. One, of course, is Egon Schiele, and he was an Austrian painter. He was a protege of Gustav Klimt, the Austrian symbolist painter, and a very prominent member of the Vienna Secession art movement. And Schiele is considered to be one of the most important figurative painters of the earliest 20th century. In 1918, you see, the Spanish flu pandemic that claimed more than 20 million lives in Europe had reached Vienna. That year, the painter had begun working on a painting which was titled The Family. It was meant to be a portrait of himself, his wife, and his future child. On the right, you can see the painting, The Family. But tragedy struck, he could never finish his piece because his wife, who was 6 months pregnant, died of the Spanish flu. And 3 days later, the painter himself also succumbed to the flu. You can take a look at this extraordinary painting on your right. Another painter that I would like to refer to is the Norwegian painter Edvard Munch. On your right, you can can see the painting, Self-Portrait with the Spanish Flu. This was about his own experience of contracting and surviving the illness. He suffered the influenza and he survived. And it shows his obsession with existential drama. It highlights the trauma and the despair of living in a pandemic that had killed so many people. In fact, he says, illness, insanity, death kept watch over my cradle and accompanied me all my life. You can take a look on your right, the self-portrait with the Spanish flu. If we move on to science again, we have here Arthur Stanley Eddington, an astronomer who was deeply interested in Einstein's general theory of relativity. Now, Eddington decided to measure the bending of light by sun's gravity during a total solar eclipse. And this eclipse occurs again in 1919 during the Spanish influenza. And he organized two expeditions, one to Brazil, one to the West Africa coast. The results confirmed the general theory of relativity. And there were, of course, further subsequent experiments. If we move further, and this is a landmark text, almost everybody is aware of this, Albert Camus' novel, The Plague, which was published in 1947 and originally in French. Now, Camus used as source material the cholera epidemic that killed a large population of the French Algerian city of Oran in 1949. But he locates the novel in the 1940s. Now, this city and its surroundings had been struck by disease several times, and I have listed them. There was the bubonic plague in 1556 and 1678, which had almost decimated the population. But the later outbreaks in 1921, again in 1931, again in 1944, they were not mentioned in the novel. Now, the novel is essentially about a plague sweeping Oran and narrated from the point of view of an unknown narrator, and obviously from the existential absurdist point of view that is the hallmark of Albert Camus. The other remarkably famous text which deals with the pandemic is, of course, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's, the Colombian novelist and short story writer who went on to win the 1982 Nobel Prize for Literature, is Love in the Time of Cholera. It was obviously first published in Spanish in 1985. Now, cholera in Spanish, of course, denotes the disease, but it also denotes passion or the human rage and ire in its feminine form. The title, Love in the Time of Cholera, is therefore a pun on cholera as disease and cholera as passion. The story concerns three characters. Fermina Daza, the lady, and the two men in her life, Florentino Ariza, who has too much passion, and Dr. Juvenal Urbino, who is committed to the eradication of cholera, who has too little. Now, the personal choice of Fermina, is also the central question of the novel. That what is more conducive to love and happiness? Is it extreme passion or is it the lack of it? Dr. Urbino's mission of eradication of cholera in the town takes on an additional meaning because simultaneously he also rids Parmina's life of rage but also of passion. This is one of the most, in a way, unromantic, in a way, romantic novels that you will ever read. The next, and of course, very well known and our contemporary novelist is Margaret Atwood, the Canadian writer. And her dystopian trilogy, which begins with the year of the flood in 2009. No, it begins with Oryx and Crake. I'm sorry, it begins with Oryx and Crake in 2003, continues to the year of the flood in 2009, and ends with martyrdom in 2019. We are concerned with the year of the flood, which was published in 2009, and it talks about a small community of survivors of a biological catastrophe, a disaster uh, meant to end the human species, a kind of a waterless flood, a viral pandemic which will destroy the human civilization. When you read this novel, it gives you goosebumps because it seems so much like the world in which we are living now. Now, the survivors are the gods' gardeners, an eco-religious sect, who combine biblical and scientific practices and beliefs and are devoted to preserving all life forms, whether it be plant or animal. Very interestingly, they farm on the rooftops because the streets are full of gangs, are infested with gangs and unsafe. And they try to create a kind of harmony with nature. In this novel, there is no geography, no history, no national government seem to be functioning. There are only corporations. By corporations is meant, of course, the MNCs and their security arms, the cops, who are in total control. There are two women in this novel, and they seem to be the only real people. Ren, who is very gentle and suffers endless degradation with endless patience, and Toby, who is tougher but who is tried to the limit and beyond. The ending of the novel is mysterious. There is no uh, direct positivity, so to speak of. It is a very dismal picture that is painted, but nonetheless, there is a hint of the affirmative because it ends with the people who are coming with torches singing. If we now move on to our own domain, that is, if we come to India and look at the literatures from the different regions, the regional literatures, what do we find? There are numerous references to the different. The Odia writer Fakir Mohan Senapati writes Rebati in 1898. It is the story of a young girl, Rebati, who wishes to study more. Her father arranges a tutor for her who is called Basu, but there is a cholera epidemic that goes on to claim the lives of her parents, Basu, and finally Rebati herself. If we look at noted Hindi writer Premchand's works, you will find the reference in several, but I have chosen just a couple. If you look at Idga, and this continues to be one of my most favorite stories, it is about a poor boy named Hamid who lives with his grandmother Amina. Hamid has lost his father to Heja or cholera. It is such a sweet story. On Eid, the other children buy candies and toys for themselves, but Hamid thinks of his grandmother, who, when she makes rotis, she burns her hands every time she makes them. And he thinks of his grandmother who Similarly, in another remarkable part memoir called Kulli Bhatt, that is the Hindi poet Suryakant Tripathi Nirala's memoir, which has been translated recently into English in 2016. You see, it was written in 1939, but it was unexpectedly ahead of its times that it was not published till 1978 and translated only in 2016. It has a whole lot of other things, but what is interesting is that it is set against the backdrop of the 1918 Spanish flu, which Suryakant Tripathi Nirala experienced for himself. and it talks about the death of his wife and other family members. In fact, when describing the Ganga, he talks that the waters could not be seen because there were so many bodies in the Ganga. If we move a little further, we can talk about the very well-known Malayalam writer Shiv Sankar Pillai's novel, The Scavenger's Son. It is also about the spread of a contagious disease through the town of Alappuzha. Many of you are familiar with noted Kannada writer Anant Murthy's masterpiece Samskara, which talks about the death of Naranappas, the Samskara, how to do the death ritual. Of course, it's an extremely intricately designed novel with a host of other possibilities. But what is interesting is that the death is caused by the bubonic plague, and which results in a lot of other complications. Similarly, the Malayalam writer Kakkanandan's text Vasuri is smallpox in Malayalam, is again set against the backdrop of smallpox in a remote hamlet in Kerala, and it displays the fragility of human relationships when set against a crisis. On your right, you can look at the cover page of Vasuri. If we look at the Pakistani novelist, he is Delhi-born Pakistani novelist Ahmed Ali. His text Twilight in Delhi, which was published in 1940, is also a moving account of the 1918-1920 Spanish flu, which, as we have been talking about, went on to decimate 12 to 17 million people in India, and globally between 50 million to 100 million. And in his text, he talks about how shroud thieves stole sheets from the graves, and how grave diggers raised their fees fourfold during the pandemic. They did not bother to see that the grave was properly dug or deep enough or not. They had so many more to dig. This from the text. Now, if we come to the Bengali poet Rabindranath Tagore, obviously he needs no introduction, the first non-European to win the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1913. Uh, he also talks about epidemics in different texts. For example, in his novel Choturango. I'm not talking about that. I have chosen two of his poems. One is his long story poem called Puraton Bhritto, and the other is his short story poem called Obhishar. And the two can perhaps be read as counter narratives, which reveal both. I mean, this is my argument that a time of epidemic or a pandemic or a time of crisis brings out both the best in man or the beast in man, right? And this is what Rabindranath Tagore also shows. This is taken from Puraton Bhritto, which has been translated as Keshta Old Man Servant of Mine by Monish R. Chatterjee. The poem is essentially about uh, a rich zamindar and his servant, Keshta, who is constantly ridiculed, and the entire family looks down upon him. But when the zamindar goes on a pilgrimage to Mathura, he is struck by the smallpox, and it is Keshta who had accompanied him and who takes care of him. You can, if we will just read the text. And finally, the zamindar recovers, but Keshta succumbs to the disease. So if we look at the text, the poem is there for you to read. I will just read the last bit. The my old man servant by my bed, he is there with him vigilant throughout, pours water in my mouth, asks if I feel better, feels my temple for fever, standing vigil with nary a wink, while not a grain of rice crossed his lips ever. I mean, this is the kind of care that he gives to his master. if we look at the next stanza, before long regaining my health as I was up and about, the fever set upon him. My life giver appropriated my fatal disease as each day his prospects grew dim. The roles have been reversed. It is Keshta who has become the life giver, and he has internalized the disease so that his Malik, he will live. Losing consciousness, he lay there for a day or two until no pulse in him was left. For so long had I tried my all to be rid of him, at long last of him was I bereft. He had tried to, chase him away, and finally he has achieved it. But the Zamindar repents. Not long after my pilgrimage over, I was back at my homestead verdant, no longer with me my perennial companion, my faithful old manservant. You know, it brings out, of course, the best in Keshta, but it also makes the Zamindar repent for the way he has treated Keshta, albeit after his death. The second one, Abhishar, this is one of my favorites. It's a short one, and it is based on the Buddhist fable of Shonnashi Upagupta and Bashobdatta, the dancer of the town. Now, once Bashobdatta had come upon Upagupta when he was lying on the bare road and had asked him to come home with her so that she could take care of him. At that time, he had said, "The time has not come for me to come to your place." At that time, Bashobdatta was at her best, it was the prime. When he does come to her, it is much later, and that is the conclusion of the poem. Beyond the city limit, if you would look at the screen, beyond the city limit went the ascetic near the outer boundary wall. He came and stood by the side of the moat near the shade of the mango grove. It is outside the city limit, somebody is lying there. He wondered who that woman was lying on her side right under his feet. She was gravely ill with pustules of smallpox spread all over her body. The dark stain of the disease has blackened her skin. The people carrying her beyond the moat of the city have thrown her away and shunned her poison company. The monk sat down and lifted her afflicted head upon his own lap. On her parched mouth, he poured water and chanted mantra over her head. With his own hand, he then smeared her body with cool sandal paste. The buds were falling, the cuckoo was cooing, the night was full of stars. Who are you, O my kind savior? Asked the woman. The monk replied, the moment of truth has arrived tonight, and here I am, Bashava Datta. You see, it, it if it brings out the beast in man, it also brings out the saint in man. You see, and when Bashobdatta was at her prime, she was the connoisseur of every eye. She was the king's favorite. But once she is struck by smallpox, she is thrown outside the city limit, and it is here that Upagupta comes and embalms her. You know, so these are the two poems that I thought would be of great interest to you. Of course, there are references to the epidemic in several other writers. For example, we can talk about Sharat Chandra Chattopadhyay, a lot of other writers, but uh, I have not gotten into that. To come back to our times, I think the best writings of these times are must be in progress. But I will make mention of two things which have especially interested me during these last almost 4 months that we have been quarantined. We have been in lockdown. One is the New York Times magazine's Decameron project, wherein 29 writers from across the world have been asked to write one short story each. And this Decameron project, as is obvious, it has drawn inspiration from Giovanni Boccaccio's The Decameron. and you can read it in this link. And some of the notable writers who have written are Margaret Atwood, her story Impatient Griselda, Kamila Shamshi, the Pakistani English writer who has written The Walk, or Eviola, the Nigerian writer who has written Sleep, and so on. There are 29 writers who have written uh, different stories. For example, Kamila Shamshi says that she takes a walk, which she's not supposed to take, and she finds other walkers, and for the first time they talk. People who have been neighbors and who have never talked. It is the pandemic which makes them draw closer and which makes them talk. Similarly, I will also talk about a film production house based in Kolkata, found in 2002, which is called Windows. And they have produced some remarkable short films during this pandemic. For example, Hing, which talks about two women, and they are exchanging recipes, and how the divisions between those working women who are at a higher platform and those who are homemakers who are at a lower platform, that is broken. Or another movie called Rupkatha, which is about doctor and his, the doctor as savior. And there are others also, Shilpi, Kajol Mashi, which are all hinged upon the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, these films can be viewed for free on their channel Windows. In conclusion, what I would like to tell is, while I was preparing this presentation for the last almost 20 days, I found that from where will I draw succor? How will I survive? And then I found that the best minds, starting from Homer to somebody like Sophocles, to somebody like Giovanni Boccaccio, to Shakespeare, to Milton, to Byron, to, if we move further down to whether it is Daniel Defoe or Isaac Newton, or to foremost painters, or if we come to our own country, people like you are Anantmurti or Rabindranath Tagore or Premchand, we find that some of the best minds, the most creative minds, have survived the pandemics and have written about the pandemics. And these are the stories, these are the narratives which give us hope, which give us the strength, which give us the belief that we too shall be able to overcome these very difficult times. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shreya ma'am, for that wonderful presentation. As we have seen that history repeats itself, and literature being a mirror of society, it has kind of helped in the documentation of all the plagues that have plagued us, not just in English literature, but as you discussed in Hindi, in Kannada, as well as in other global languages that we have literature present in. It has prophesized doom, but human beings are resilient and they have somehow overcome the difficult times. And I hope that the same is going to happen with us as well. Now, there are a lot of questions that have come up from the participants, and I'll be moderating it for you. Dr. Janet Andrew Shah asks that it is interesting to note that mankind has been plagued by epidemics and pandemics. How much do we differ from the steps taken to contain it?
It is very interesting, in the sense that if we go back to Homer or to Sophocles, these aspects of quarantine, the aspect of lockdown, the maintaining of physical distance, these were the steps taken even in ancient times, because medical science had not really advanced the way it has advanced in the last two
Present
centuries,
times.
for example. But yes, but of course, today with COVID-19, which still doesn't have a vaccine, we are again, in a way, back in the times of Sophocles, maybe, or Boccaccio, maybe, where the only recourse is to look after your personal safety and the safety of your family by trying to stay indoors as much as possible. See how a gap of 2000 years has not really changed much, and that is why we can relate so much, and that is why literature is so important.
Yes, ma'am, definitely. Ma'am, we have another question from Dr. Inamul Kabir Pasa. And he would like to know if you think that revisiting these literary classics of pandemic can give us some therapeutic relief.
I'm glad that this question has been asked, because some people might think that if the times are so critical and if the times are so sad, why should we read a text which again talks of such issues, which are so maybe so full of despair and disillusionment. But believe me, it is those texts which will also give you the means to fight back. It will give
Yes,
you the means to restore yourself. These are also basically affirmative texts. So it will
yes,
also teach you how to live such difficult times. And that is why it is important to read these texts now as never before, right?
yes, ma'am, definitely. Ma'am, one more question from Dr. Sumant Kumar Jha. He asks,
Yes.
can we draw lessons from history to minimize the mortality of human race? And what in particular can be the course of action, according to you?
See, I always feel that when you are into a discipline like literature or a discipline like history, it is imperative that you learn the lessons from history. If you do not learn the lessons from history, as Freud would say, that you would be in a trap committed to endlessly repeating the same mistakes. So obviously, we need to learn from history, and uh, till the vaccine, as and when it is found, we have to follow what was followed in history. The very simple things: how to quarantine yourself, how to stay safe. If we as educated people, we do not understand that we should not go to the street corner for a cup of tea, or that it is okay, if we think it is okay not to use the mask when we are talking with friends, if we do not understand, how do you expect the common man in the rural areas or in the urban slums will understand these things? So obviously we have to understand these things from history. When there was no medicine available, what happened was quarantine. You
Yes.
have to stay indoors, you have to take care of yourselves. These are the basic measures that you have to take if you wish to survive the pandemic.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, we'll end this question answer with just last question. This is coming from Roshni Kumari. And she says that the COVID-19 pandemic is repeating history. And as you have talked about the plagues, epidemic, and pandemic that has occurred before, and how it left its impact on the writer's mind that made them write the literature. So her question is, how the literature of the 21st century, which is being written during these times, will influence or affect the readers in future? This is kind of a rhetorical question, but I'll just like to have an opinion from your side as well.
No, of course, as I told you, and that is why I gave you two examples as to the kind of creative work that is being done at this time. Obviously, I believe that some good creative work, maybe literature, maybe painting, maybe films, would definitely emerge from these times. And just as Sophocles, whose play was staged in 429 BC, is giving us succor today, I believe that the literature that will be written during our times will give succor to generations of human beings in the times to come. I have that faith. I have that belief.
Yes.
That is what literature does to you. Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Definitely, we should be moving forward with a very positive note that since these many generations who have witnessed like so many times plague has been witnessed since 88th century, and we have survived it till now, we are going to survive in the future as well. So these times are going to come to an end, I hope, and everything will become normal once again. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. It was very enriching and very informative. And I really liked how you presented and took us on a journey through time. And thank you so much, ma'am. I would now request Dr. Afrinul Haq Khan, convener and head of Department English, to propose the vote of thanks for the session. Afrin, ma'am.
Thank you, Prachi. Prachi, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you're audible.
Thank you. Warm greetings to everyone present here, Honorable Principal and Patron of the conference and Chair UGC CPE, Dr. Sister Jyoti, respected Vice Principal, Sister Shobha, our esteemed resource person, Dr. Shreya Bhattacharji, dear colleagues and esteemed dignitaries, participants, and faculty members from India and abroad. It was a highly interesting, engaging, and fascinating presentation. Thank you, ma'am, for sharing your views on the topic Voices of Hope and Wings of Creativity Surviving COVID-19 Pandemic. Literature definitely articulates and expresses hope and optimism. Literature is replete with voices of hope, and hope gives us courage and strength during times of crisis. As Lord Alfred Tennyson has rightly said, hope smiles from the threshold of the year to come, whispering, it will be happier. Thank you, ma'am, for enriching us with your views and devoting your precious time to our conference. My heartfelt thanks to our Honorable Principal, Dr. Sister Jyoti. Thank you, Sister, for your support, guidance, encouragement, and motivation. Let me say, even at the cost of reiteration, Sister, you are our pillar of strength and sponsor of causes for the welfare, growth, and advancement of our institution. I still remember the day when we shared the theme of the conference with you, and instantly you said, go ahead. And today, here we are, jointly organizing the conference with the Department of Political Science. Thank you, Sister, once again. My special thanks to our Honorable Vice Principal, Sister Shobha. Sister, your sweet smile always motivates us. My sincere gratitude to the management and faculty members of Nirmala College for their fantastic support and enthusiastic participation. My special thanks to our young and talented and smart host and moderator, Mrs. Prachi Politigga, for handling the session with great expertise. I am also grateful to all the participants, faculty members, and dignitaries from India and abroad who have made the day 2, session 3 of our conference a resounding success. Thank you, one and all present here.
Thank you, Afrin ma'am, for your kind words. And thank you, sister, for your gracious presence and support here. Thanks to all the participants for joining us on Zoom as well as live stream on YouTube. Thank you once again. Before we wind up the session, there are a few announcements that I would like to make. The next session for the day will begin at 3 p.m. The links for the next session has been shared in the WhatsApp group. So please stay tuned and thank you for joining us. The feedback forms have been shared with all of you in the Zoom chat box and in the YouTube stream chat box as well. So kindly do the needful. Thank you everyone once again. With your permission, sister, I would like to end the session. Okay, thank you, sister.
Go ahead.
Yes, sister, thank you.